In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint an autumn tree in watercolor. Let's get started. Feel free to use any materials you have on hand. I'll list the materials I'm using in the description below. I have my 140-pound cold press arches paper here that I tape to a hard surface. For the brush, use the largest brush that you have. I'm using the 1.5-inch modeler brush from Princeton Elite. For the background layer, I'm mixing a lot of water with Phthalo Blue by Daniel Smith to make a wash of light blue. This is gonna be the sky. So for skies, I usually do darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. You just want to do more paint at the top and then more water at the bottom. I feel like the color I laid down initially isn't dark enough, so I'm just gonna add more darker color just so that it kind of pops a little bit more. This layer doesn't need to be perfect because we're gonna cover it up later a lot, but this is just so that we can see some of the sky peeking through the leaves. We just want this layer to be pretty light because we're gonna layer another color on top of this later on. Don't worry if it's uneven because only a little bit of this layer will show through the next couple of layers that we're gonna add on. Let this dry completely. I'm gonna be making an orange by mixing yellow and red. For the yellow, I'm using New Gamboge by Daniel Smith. For my red, I'm grabbing quinacridone rose and just making sure I get a really thick, juicy consistency and putting it on the other half of my mixing palette. I'm not mixing this fully because sometimes I'm gonna want an orange mixture, but sometimes I'm gonna want a more yellow paint, and then sometimes I'm gonna want a more red paint. By not mixing it evenly each time I dip my brush into the paint, I can adjust how yellow or how red it's gonna be. For this next layer, we're gonna start working on the autumn leaves. I'm just dabbing it onto my paper and just making sure I have some little spaces in between the leaves so that the sky can show through. And I'm just varying up how yellow or how red it is or how orange it is and making sure I have some light colors, some dark colors, some medium colors, and just kind of making it random. I started on one corner of the paper, going up, and then I'm just gonna keep going until I fill out most of the area. If you feel like some of the areas are not dark enough, you can drop in some more paint into them. I'm just doing some very loose, quick dabbing strokes, not really trying to make any particular shape, just some random shapes, but just making sure that the shapes that I'm making are organic and natural looking. I'm making sure I don't have any straight lines or shapes that are too symmetrical. I'm basically just making small round shapes that are uneven and just making sure that they're kind of connected at certain edges. I just want to make sure that I'm transitioning from yellow to orange to red and just like kind of keeping it varied. Aside from varying up the color, I'm also varying up the brush strokes that I'm doing. So I'm not doing like perfect round circles, but more like just rough, loose kind of suggestions of leaves. I also want the colors to bleed and mix into each other naturally on the page. So if the yellow bleeds into the red or the red bleeds into the yellow, I'm embracing those natural things that are happening on the page and even sometimes encouraging that by making sure that I have enough water, that it kind of flows together a little bit, but not too much water where it's so puddly. So I know for the next layers that I'm gonna be adding the tree trunk. So I've kept the middle area kind of lighter than the rest of the areas where the trunk is gonna be so that when I layer my trunk on top of the leaves, that the layer that I have is gonna show through. But I didn't want to just leave it blank. So I'm just grabbing some more darker value red and just kind of dropping it into certain areas that I feel weren't dark enough, and just kind of adding that to areas that I feel are too light, and just adding variety to the areas where I feel like it didn't become dark enough. I also want to make sure I'm working quickly because I want to drop this in while the paper is still wet. So you don't want to necessarily drop this in when the paper is dry, because then you're going to get those hard edges. Once you're happy with your leaves layer, we're going to let this dry completely again and start with the next layer, which is the trunk. You can use any brown that you have on hand. I am mixing my own brown by mixing all the primary colors together. I'm mixing phthalo blue with quinacridone rose and new gamboge to make a kind of reddish brown. If you don't want to mix your own brown, you can use something like burnt sienna, but really any brown that you have on hand will work. But because for my brown, I'm mixing it using the colors that I already used previously, this is going to give the painting a little bit more color harmony naturally, because all the colors are kind of related to each other. I'm going to start painting the trunk. I'm going to paint a line from the bottom right of the paper going up, and then also another line from the bottom left corner of the paper going up, and they're going to meet roughly in the center of the paper. It's going to be wider at the bottom and get narrower as it goes higher. And then between those two lines that I painted, I'm just going to paint inside those two lines with some brown. I'm making sure that everything is varied as far as values. So some parts are darker, some parts are lighter. And the stroke that I'm doing is just downward strokes or upward strokes, but making sure that my strokes are parallel to the initial two lines that I made, because that's what's going to give it that perspective of it being larger at the bottom, because that's closer to us as the viewer, and then becoming smaller at the top because that's farther from us. At the top of the trunk, we're just going to paint branches coming out of that trunk, and they're kind of just gonna go from the trunk to the edge of the page, making sure that the branches are not super straight. They kind of have a more natural organic shape, and they meet in certain points, and maybe they disappear in certain points because they're behind the leaves, and some are darker, some are lighter, and I'm just using the tip of my brush to make those finer lines. I'm just mixing more brown because I ran out of brown. And it doesn't matter if it didn't match the brown that I had before, because I want my browns to be varied and not just boring same color. On the left side, I'm painting a branch that kind of starts out a little bit thicker and then becomes thinner as it goes outwards, because that's how trees are. The branches that are closer to the trees are older, so they're thicker, and then the branches that are farther from the trunk are smaller and newer. So I want to do like a main branch and then have smaller branches come off of it. The main branches are coming from the center of the tree trunk towards the edge of the pages in kind of a radial pattern, so that we can show that perspective of us looking at it from below. The smaller branches coming off of the main branches can be a little bit more random, but the main branches should kind of emanate from that tree trunk to the edge. I'm also varying up how many branches come off of the main branches. So some of the main branches might have 2 or 3 sub branches, while other branches might have 4 or 5 sub branches. And those sub branches can also have more branches that come off of them. I feel like some of these branches are not dark enough, so I'm adding a darker value of the brown, so some of these can be a little bit darker, and I'm darkening the trunk as well. Again, I'm starting from those 2 outer lines of the trunk and then doing the other lines in between parallel to those 2 lines. And I'm kind of being more varied with my strokes so that there are light and dark areas in between those lines. It's not just a flat brown, but more of a brown that has some dark areas, some light areas, so that we can show that like this trunk has some shadows and some light areas, and it's not just like a plain even brown. Again, I'm just going over the outer lines of the trunk and making those darker, starting with the left side and then going on to the right side. And I'm gonna start doing some smaller lines in the middle. Again, they're parallel to the 2 outer lines to show that perspective. So they're kind of from the bottom meeting up at the top. That kind of adds a little bit more detail to our trunk. I just want to darken these branches so that they kind of look more in line with how dark our trunk is. I switched to my smaller round tube brush so I can get those finer lines. Just remember that if your brush is smaller, it holds less water and less paint, so you do have to dip your brush into the paint more often, but it's easier to get the smaller, finer, more delicate lines using a smaller brush. I'm drawing more branches here and sub branches. You can really do as many branches as you wish. Where there are blank spaces between the leaves, I'm just adding some branches in there. And that gives the illusion that those branches are behind the leaves that are next to it. They don't necessarily have to connect to anything. The viewer's mind kind of fills up those blanks and kind of extrapolates that there are more branches behind there. So it makes it look like there are more branches that are hiding. I try to do sometimes a zigzag fashion so that the branches are not a straight line, but they kind of go this way and that a little bit. I'm also fighting the urge to make all the branches parallel to each other because that's the natural inclination, is to kind of copy the branch that's next to it. So I kind of have to force my brain to consciously not copy the branch next to it and not follow that line. So I'm trying to really vary it up and switch it up a lot. The branches are probably the most intricate part of this painting, and that is really what sells this painting, is having those branches look realistic. Make sure you don't forget the corners, the edges, the sides, because those imply that the tree goes farther than what your paper can fit. Your branches shouldn't just be in the middle, they should also be on the sides. If you like this video, make sure you check out some of my other videos about watercolor painting.